And we will start with some information that we have gathered from students who have participated in previous panels and live webinars we have hosted. Approximately 74% of deaf college students considered online learning more difficult than traditional learning. The panel we hosted back in April of 2020 gave us this statistic, and there have probably been shifts since then. But students were facing this change to online learning happening rapidly. So they missed the opportunity to have conversations with DSS professionals. And it was important for us to keep that in mind when we're planning for the future. This quote is a very common complaint we saw from students and a concern that students were not included. They were not provided ASL interpreters. They needed tutoring services, but experienced barriers when we shifted to online. And so many indicated that they were worn out and frustrated from the process of that shift that happened during the beginning of the pandemic. Students indicated that they felt like they were a burden and they didn't want to feel that way. And so we want to provide you, deaf student services professionals, tools to help alleviate that.
So, for you all to understand the challenge of the barrier, it requires an interactive dialogue with the deaf student. It's vital that disability services professionals understand the deaf student's perspective, and they're on a spectrum of both hearing loss and communication needs. Accommodation options should therefore be considered on a case by case basis. It's not a one size fits all approach. In fact, deaf students come from a variety of different backgrounds, different experiences, related directly to communication and accommodations. So, this is why it's so important to consider their perspective during that interactive dialogue and also just be open to a kind of trial and error process. For example, some deaf students come into college without any prior experience with specific accommodations. And also, accommodations may shift and change or evolve over time. It may depend on a different class or a different setting. All classes differ, so those accommodations may also differ. It's important to be flexible. NDC has what we call interactive process tools. These are a great resource to learn more about the deaf student's experience and gives you options on what types of questions to even ask. So we have a checklist and some sample questions that'll kind of just walk you through a discussion with deaf students about what impacts them, what accommodations may reduce barriers for them. One approach that we want to avoid, though, is the over reliance upon students' documentation. For example, an audiogram. Now, many people don't understand that an audiogram is performed in a soundproof, quiet space. And so it's impossible for the documentation to accurately reflect and capture or consider all different types of communication barriers, those different settings and environments that a student will face. It's simply impossible for that audiogram to capture that. Another example is many deaf students transition from high school into college and don't even realize it's a faster pace. That's not considered. There may be less one on one time to talk with that professor versus a teacher back in K 12. They may struggle to understand that transition from high school into college. Again, I'd like to emphasize why that interactive process and asking those questions to determine communication, effectiveness, and preferences of the deaf students is just so important. Their experience with technology is a factor, their familiarity with different accommodations is also something to consider. Now, most students, nowadays, especially during COVID, they've all experienced online or virtual learning. So they may be able to express what has worked and what has not worked for them. Some may not have had all these different experiences, but that's something to consider. A few examples of important or relevant questions for this fall semester for you to consider. If it's a virtual course, will that course have activities? Will it be synchronous or asynchronous? Good questions. Now, the reason that's important because there's some unique access considerations applied to each of them. If it's synchronous, you may need to schedule a service provider at the right time. If it's an asynchronous course, you may need the media to be made into an accessible format, something to think about. Another question to ask is now that things are opening up more and more, there might be some activities outside of the classroom. Some classes may have required, let's say, group work, a group project, maybe attend an event, some field work, a whole host of things that may come up. And that's something to consider for a holistic overall accommodation plan as you approach this coming semester.
Let's talk about face masks. It definitely presents a barrier for students because it can block critical information, whether that be from facial expression, the ability to lip read. It can muffle speech that can be heard by some who rely on residual hearing. And masks definitely have been a barrier. In the beginning of the pandemic, many stakeholders were reaching out to us because masks were required everywhere. And the clear masks were becoming very popular, but they're still not 100% accessible. Some of those masks have a really bright pattern or design that makes it difficult to concentrate on the lip reading. Some fogged up, which made the clear window basically irrelevant. Some of the windows were very small. And so just realize that clear masks are still not accessible. They may be okay for one-on-one meetings with someone, but in a big group setting or in a classroom, it's not going to be accessible. The face shield was something else stakeholders asked us about. They asked if face shields would be effective. While it does provide more visibility, it did not provide full protection from the COVID virus. So health professionals were letting us know that a face shield alone was not enough. So that was a big issue for people who were trying to decide if they felt comfortable going into a classroom only with a face shield. That 6 feet of distance was another concern. Some deaf individuals don't see well at a distance that far, and some service providers weren't comfortable getting any closer than 6 feet. So that was definitely an issue that students and providers faced. Some strategies that we've learned working with masks. First, check with your campus and know if the campus requires masks to be worn. Maybe sometimes they're required in specific rooms and not in others. Maybe some rooms have a limited number of people who can be in a particular room. And then check with the faculty, with the service providers to see if they're comfortable using particular types of masks. If they insist on wearing a mask, then look at other options for accommodations because masks will continue to be a barrier. It's important to discuss with the student what they prefer as well, that if masks are going to be used, that remote services might be a better option, remote services where the providers aren't needing to wear masks. Remote services can support many things, not just the classroom services, but can provide services for a last minute need, either an interpreter or a speech to text provider. Like I had just mentioned, maybe the classroom is limited. There can't be any more people in the classroom, but remote services could work out so that the provider can be remote, or maybe the student could be remote and the provider is in the classroom. If you have a provider who had a last minute cancellation or someone is sick and having to stay home, remote services can be a fantastic solution to fill in those gaps. Remote services offer a consistency. Students may want a particular provider that doesn't live nearby, that isn't in the area. In that case, A remote interpreter can provide that consistency that the student is looking for. Some of you may live in rural areas. Your schools may be in a rural area where your options are more limited, and providing remote services broadens your options. Remote services can be provided for people who have concerns with other high health risks and students who may not want to go into the classroom. Maybe classes are beginning to meet in person, but because of health issues, they are not comfortable going back to class yet. The student could join the class remotely if they're not comfortable yet being around people. Maybe they weren't able to get vaccinated for whatever reason. The students can be remote while everyone else is in the classroom. So think about the ways remote services could support all of these variables we come across. Right here, just briefly, I want to show there are 4 images here that talk about remote services setup option. In the top left corner is in-person plus a remote provider, and that could be an interpreter or speech to text. At the top right, it could be online, just a one screen with a presenter and service provider sharing a screen. And again, when I'm saying service provider, it could be transcription or an interpreter. At the bottom, we see separate platforms using a split screen. That uses 2 different browser windows, one to access the class and another to access the service provider. At the bottom right, it shows using 2 separate devices. Maybe the phone wouldn't be sufficient, but the phone could be used just to display the instructor while the deaf student watches the service provider on the laptop. So I put this here just to show you there are many different ways to configure what access may look like for that student. And we wanted to show you this just to spark some ideas for you.
So you may run into a deaf student who primarily receives information relying on their residual hearing, a hearing aid, or a cochlear implant. So that's where ALS or assistive listening systems may support them. For example, an FM system that can support access for some students in their auditory information. And it reduces the background noise, really helps them increase their focus on the spoken information. ALS can also enhance the quality of the sound, especially if your classroom and the professor, a lot of those students are wearing masks, and we know that masks really muffle sound of a voice and it reduces the voice projection as well, which then means an FM system for a student who needs one can help support access to that auditory information. Next slide. Now we've noticed several questions coming up about ALS related to the technology for cleanliness or sanitizing, or if you want to use a different type of microphone, let's say. So the devices can in fact be cleaned and sanitized. It's important to follow the manufacturer's guidelines on how to do that appropriately. So it could be, many devices can be cleaned simply with a disinfectant wipe. You can just wipe it down and that cleans it. Microphones, however, are a little bit more complicated in terms of sanitization because you can damage the membrane in that mic, and you don't want to do that because then it will render it useless. So, some challenges that we've come across is that professors didn't want to share a microphone, like a lapel mic, for example. Now, if that's the case, maybe consider doling out and assigning a professor an individual lapel mic for that semester for their use. Another option is maybe a tabletop microphone. And so it doesn't have to be on that person, it can be strategically placed in the classroom in order to pick up the different speakers in that room. Again, it really depends on the size of the room. That's something to be mindful of when making that decision, but that's something to think about. You'll have to investigate your system and see if it allows for multiple microphones to be hooked up or a tabletop option. I'd like to wrap up with this quote. This quote's from a keynote presenter from Higher Ed Reset. It was a leadership summit. And Michael Crow made this statement. And what he said was, we will never go back to normal. We're going to start a new normal. And a new normal means you have to be flexible, adaptable, technologically capable, and technologically projectable. You have to be able to be adaptive quickly. So, as your campuses adapt and get back online in those variety of learning environments on site and remotely, it's important to continue to have that dialogue with your deaf students to figure out how you can best support an equitable educational experience for them during their college time.